Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Poldark's Aidan Turner discovers that for Shan Tarbet, love is blind in this unconventional comedy drama. Bess Craft, played by Shan Tarbet, suffers from an unusual condition called Selective Perception and cannot see her mother Carolyn, played by Chloe Sevigny, believing that she is dead despite living in the same home where Bess takes care of her father Murray, played by Matthew Broderick, who suffers from Parkinson's disease. Bess's case is of great interest to her autistic psychiatrist Farmer Smithson, played by Benjamin Walker, who attempts to introduce Bess to suicidal demolition worker Russell, played by Aidan Turner, only to discover that she cannot see him either. Russell falls in love with Bess despite the fact that she doesn't even believe that he exists, but will he be able to overcome Bess's condition? Love is Blind is the feature directorial debut of Monty Whitebloom and Annie Delaney, a pair of music video directors who are often credited as Big TV. They've worked with the likes of the Spice Girls, Maroon 5 and George Michael, among many others, but clearly something has gone very wrong during the course of this production. For a start, it's taken 4 years for it to be released. I know this shot in 2015 with absolute certainty because you can actually see banners in the background of a scene prominently displaying the year it was shot. So obviously there's been a lot of air team work done on this movie. Also, it's changed title multiple times. It was originally filmed under the name Look Away, but presumably they had to change that once they realised the horror film was coming out with that title, so it became Beautiful Darkness, which is inspired by a wildly pretentious line in this film, but it was eventually released under the name of Love is Blind in the UK, but I don't know if that's going to be the name this comes out under in the States, because the UK distributor Signature has a habit of just renaming movies to make them more commercially appealing. So pretty much this movie has only been released in the UK and has been widely ignored by pretty much everyone except hardcore Aidan Turner fans. This came out on VOD in March, exceptionally quietly considering the talent that's attached to it, but man oh man, I want you to see this movie. I wouldn't normally cover something like this, but this is an absolutely glorious train wreck that you cannot look away from. You need to see this movie. This really is car crash filmmaking. This movie is absolutely bonkers from the premise up. It's a good argument for why an original idea is not necessarily the same thing as a good one. Now, I know we're in the realms of magical realism here, and we have to suspend our disbelief somewhat, but typically, in order to do that, one actually has to believe what is happening on screen. That is definitely not the case for me, and what this film calls selective perception, which really is a misnomer in my opinion. That makes it sound like she has some sort of vision issue, that she's blind to certain people. Oh no, it goes far beyond that. Bess in this film not just can't see these people, she effectively erases them from her entire consciousness. So if Bess can't see a person, she doesn't not see them, she also doesn't hear the words that they say. If they walk in through a door, she apparently does not perceive the door to open and close by some kind of invisible force, doesn't hear the bag that they're carrying or see that as well. It's a real stretch, to be honest, to get the audience to understand that. And then of course, that doesn't even factor in other things like, okay, why does no one try to contact her through writing? Why does no one try to exchange notes with her or texts or anything like that? Does that work in some way? And if you're asking questions like that, that's the fault of the film not actually articulating its core idea properly, and instead it ends up being hopelessly confusing. If you even think about it for the slightest amount of time, you end up being not really sure how much Bess is actually aware of the world around her in the slightest. That really makes a mess of the entire movie right from the outset. And I'm not trying to say that this could never make for a good film. Like any idea, it all comes down to the execution. And ironically enough, I think a lot of it comes down to a choice of perspective on the part of the filmmakers, because Bess is characterised as being an innocent who is barely even aware that she has a condition in the first place. But imagine for a second if you reframe this story slightly so that Bess was willfully willfully, purposely erasing people from her perspective. Not only does that clear a whole host of holes in the conceit, but imagine the storytelling possibilities there, that she's avoiding something that she doesn't want to face. Unfortunately, the filmmakers chose the wrong fork in the road and chaos reigns. Now, that's not to say that Love is Blind doesn't explore some of the ideas in its conceit. It does try to imply that Bess's condition is linked to some kind of trauma in her past. We get frequent recurring flashbacks which supposedly reveal some kind of root cause to her condition. Unfortunately, by the time that happens, far too late into the narrative, we still don't understand it. It still makes no sense to us, because unfortunately, how does event A escalate into her entire condition B? It really does show that the filmmakers didn't know what to do with their central idea. And then, on top of that, this movie's supposed to be a romance, and how exactly are you supposed to craft a love story between two characters, one of which not only doesn't know the other one exists, but doesn't even believe that he does in the first place? The romance between Bess and Russell is exceptionally one-sided on his part, and it just ends up being incredibly uncomfortable. The romance plays out thusly, in that psychiatrist Farmer suggests to Beth that she behave like some figment of imagination is around her, and then Russell essentially just follows her for a good chunk of the movie. He becomes infatuated with her at first sight, and so he's essentially riding in the back of her truck, and she's not aware of that in the slightest. He's working in a garage, which again, nothing. He spots her running naked out of the shower, and that's the point where it starts getting really, really creepy. This isn't a love story. It comes across as incredibly stalkerish, and that's before the moment where he lifts her off the bed, which makes it look like she's being raised up by some kind of invisible force. Bess isn't even aware of Russell as a character until very late into the film, so the movie doesn't even work on that level. It's so fundamentally misguided in every single thing that it tries to do. It wants to tell this kind of fairy tale story, but it comes across as just hopelessly warped. The script by TV writer Jennifer Sher is absolutely awful, in large part because none of the characters even remotely acts like a human being. All of them are written as quirks in human flesh. They've got their one defined attribute, and they write cuteness all around it. For example, Bess is wholly defined by a selective perception, which gives Shan Tarbet virtually nothing to play, and also she's written as an optometrist. Do you get it? Because she's measuring other people's eyesight, but also she's blind to other people. Isn't that ironic? And that tone pretty much sets up the characterization in this film, which is bad news if you're dealing with fairly sensitive subjects like this movie is. Aidan Turner is trying to do his best here. He's actually got a fairly good American accent, but he's saddled with the fact that he has to do awful, droning, nihilistic voiceover throughout the entire film as if it wasn't totally imbalanced in the first place, and then the way the film treats his character's suicidal tendencies, they make it seem like it's more the subject of dark comedy. So if he sees a red light, he deliberately speeds his way through it. He's eating fast food all the way through because he wants to raise his cholesterol. There's actually a moment where they do the classic Buster Keaton house gag where it falls down around him in CGI. That's how they treat that subject in this film. And when they do try to address why he might be doing it, it's purely in fantastical terms. Instead of giving him a credible, understandable reason for why he's doing it, instead they explain that the reason that he feels compelled to try and take his life is because he feels some sort of strange desire to be invisible, which turns out to be perfect when he meets Bess, because he meets a person where he is literally invisible to her. That's how he knows it's true love. And then we have Benjamin Walker of Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter as the ridiculously named psychiatrist Farmer Smithson, and that isn't even the worst detail about his character, for you see he's autistic, which is written in the most offensively stereotypical way you can think of. He's another one of those kind of characters that is just seen as intensely literal at all times. Despite the fact that he's ostensibly meant to be incredibly smart, he has an entire wall of psychiatry degrees from prestigious universities, but apparently is totally unfamiliar with the concept of metaphors, rhetorical questions, and sarcasm. I kid you not, there's actually a moment where he starts monologuing about the roundness of hamburgers for some reason. I was suddenly getting flashbacks to the infamous hot dog speech from The Happening. That's always a good thing to think of. This character is so terribly written, he comes across as incredibly creepy. He's meant to be the other part of the central love triangle. He's Bess's psychiatrist, but he's also her romantic interest, which is a big no-no considering his profession, and just makes him really seem unpleasant as a character. And there's also this weirdness to their psychiatry sessions. There's a scene where he tries an experimental treatment on her called rebirthing, where he lies on top of her so that she's in the womb, and she has to push out from underneath him, and the psychosexual undertones to that scene are just totally skin-crawling. It's meant to be humorous, and it's just uncomfortable. And that's before the point where he slaps her in the face in a jealous rage. He is really written in a terribly unsympathetic way, and Walker is terrible in this film. Chloe Sevigny is totally squandered as Bess Mother because pretty much her entire role is to be ignored. She just sits around on the sidelines of scenes whilst the other characters pretend she isn't there, or in Bess's case, don't know she is. There's actually a moment where she tells the doctor, just pretend like I'm not here for the sake of maintaining the charade. And the way the film opens, it looks like this mother-daughter relationship is going to be its central focus, but of course, about halfway through, once the romance angle kicks in, this just gets totally discarded, and the character is just left drifting through the rest of the film. And to some extent, that does echo what the character goes through in the story, in that she's meant to be feeling invisible and lacking any kind of purpose, and she's dealing with a whole lot of grief, but unfortunately it squanders Sevigny, and also her performance really comes across as standoffish and unpleasant. And I know that makes sense given the character, but it doesn't make her especially appealing, and also the movie suffers from a lack of resolution to that plot in the first place. By the time the ending rolls around, you barely get a sense that the relationship between mother and daughter has improved in any real way, despite the fact that the film opened with it at the centre of it. The only person that gets out of this movie in any way unscathed is Matthew Broderick, and that's mostly because he's barely in this film in the first place. About 20 minutes in, he goes in for surgery, and then he spends the entire rest of the movie just asleep in his hospital bed. It might be some of the easiest work Matthew Broderick has ever done. If I have to give White, Blue and Delaney some credit, they do stumble across the odd visually arresting image at times, particularly in the way it convey Bess's condition. For example, there's a scene in the back garden where Bess's family is, and Bess's mother appears and disappears in the same shot depending on when the characters walk past her. Later on in Farmer's office, Russell isn't seen in the foreground, but we see him reflected in a mirror in the background. These might be composite shots or simple camera trickery, but they work. Later on, Russell is doing his demolition work, and it's presented as this mirror split screen effect. And again, that's striking, but a lot of the time, it doesn't seem like these are actually serving the story or its themes of grief or denial. It simply seems like it's there for the sake of having pretty pictures, which, considering that these are already on top of an affectation-laden script, just makes the problems even worse. And also, there are decisions which are downright baffling. This is the kind of movie where Bess has conversations with a white CGI peacock that she owns in her garden. This is the kind of film where three characters suddenly have a dance montage in the middle of it for absolutely no reason. There's a bewildering early scene where Bess's mother walks into the kitchen where Bess is, apparently just out of the shower, and she's got a towel over her head, a half-buttoned shirt, but otherwise is totally nude. And I go, why? Why make that decision? Is it meant to be shocking or provocative? I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense, because if Bess can't see her, she might as well wander around like that, but it just seems gratuitous and out of place and totally unnecessary. And even though White, Blue and Delaney have a lot of music video credits, their inexperience at filmmaking is blatantly obvious. There's a lot of sloppy technical errors all throughout this. For example, just 3 minutes in, we see Chloe Sevigny standing in the background of a scene in a doorway, except she's not supposed to be there yet. The next shot is a close-up of her approaching the door, but of course we didn't shoot this with enough coverage, so now we got a sloppy continuity error. And this is most blatantly obvious in terms of the cinematography, which is really subtly off all throughout, because for some reason, characters are framed with their heads very close to the top of the frame. In cinematography terms, that's a big no-no, because that's an easy way of getting them decapitated, either when you're filming the shot or when the movie is going to be projected in cinemas or in TV overscan. You basically don't do it. You don't use that as the marker. You give them some kind of headspace, except this movie does this over and over again. And I was just thinking, how did this happen? How did this kind of sloppiness get through? Surely you would think that some experienced director of photography would tell the directors not to do this, and then you realise that the director of photography is Monty Whitebloom. And then you understand how that happened. Essentially, the movie looks like a very slickly polished student film at times. Love is Blind is staggeringly awful. It doesn't work as comedy, it doesn't work as drama, and it sure doesn't work as a romance. Every second that you're watching it, you realise exactly why it sat on the shelf for 4 years, and why it was dumped out like an embarrassment, because it is. It does have a fairly unique idea, but it executes it incredibly badly and in such a perplexing way that I just found myself entranced by its badness. And so I can only recommend it to either die-hard Aidan Turner fans that literally just watch everything that he's in because he's in Poldark, or to bad movie fans. More people need to see this movie. They need to talk about it and all the weird decisions that it takes. If you're the kind of person that watches movies like The Book of Henry for their just wildly misjudged values and what they think they're attempting to make instead of what they're actually making, then you will have a hell of a time with this movie. For everyone else, cast your glance aside and just make this film as invisible as it was before I did this video. Love is Blind, or Beautiful Darkness, or whatever you want to call it, is a misfire of staggering proportions that makes it clear exactly why it took 4 years to get a very minor release despite a starry cast. The premise aims for magical realism but stretches the audience's credibility and endurance given that it is neither well explained or makes much sense, and the central romance is bizarrely executed to the extent that Aidan Turner effectively stalks his oblivious love interest. Most of the cast are unlikable and written as quirks instead of characters, especially true of Turner's suicidal tendencies and Walker's autism, while Broderick is barely in the movie and Sevigny stands around as the film ignores her as much as her daughter does. Music video directors Monty Whitebloom and Andy Delaney have an eye for an arresting image, but these drown the film in affectation, and their inexperience shows in a number of sloppy technical errors in continuity and cinematography. Failing at romance or examining grief and denial, Love is Blind is such a bewildering mess that you can seldom believe your eyes. If you like this review, then cast your glance over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.